day, everyone, and welcome to the Heritage and Waste webinar presented by the NSERC Create Heritage Engineering Program at Carleton University with the collaboration of Tampere University, ERA Architects, Emerald Publishing, ICOMOS Canada, and the Association for Preservation Technology. My name is Victoria Angel, and I'm a heritage planner and an associate at ERA Architects, and I'm based in Ottawa, Canada. I was also the guest editor with Susan Ross of the special issue of the Journal of Cultural Heritage Management and Sustainable Development on the theme of heritage and waste, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. I'm joined today by our three panelists. Dr. Satu Hukka is an architect and senior research fellow and adjunct professor in the School of Architecture at Tampere University in Finland. Susan Ross is an architect and an associate professor cross-appointed to the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies and the School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University in Canada. And Tina McCarthy is a preservation planner with the town of Brookline, Massachusetts, and she co-owns a general contracting firm specializing in sustainable building and material reuse. Also joining us today are Dr. Mario Santana and Laurie Smith of the NSERC Create Heritage Engineering Program, and Zainab Ekim, who's an intern architect at ERA Architects, who will be assisting with moderating this event. And Dr. Ona Valakis, who is co-editor of the journal with Mario Santana, will now say a few words about the journal and its mandate.
Thank you, Victoria. Good day, everyone. On behalf of Emerald Publishing and the Journal of Cultural Heritage Management and Sustainable Development, Professor Mario Santana, my co-editor, and our editorial team, I would like to thank you and the other participants and panelists for the invitation to be part of this webinar. Maybe some of you might be asking why this journal has to do with waste. Was it not about cultural heritage? Well, waste has to do with heritage, and it was illustrated in 2020 when the same group of experts presenting today published a special issue on the journal called Heritage and Waste Values. And I would like to borrow some words quoted in the introduction as follows. New heritage suggests that instead of finding the best, calling it heritage, and fighting to keep it, we should look with open eyes at all that exists, accept that at some level it is all heritage, and then decide how best to use it for social and future values. This may involve traditional preservation, but it may not. The Journal of Cultural Heritage Management and Sustainable Development stimulates and encourages research devoted to the sustainable development of cultural heritage and to the positive contribution of cultural heritage management towards a sustainable environment. It disseminates the results of innovative research and practices, continuing to the improvement of current practices while developing and applying new and emerging ones. With this, I would like to announce today that the special issue Heritage, Waste and Values will be available for free for a month starting from today. Here on the screen, you have the link to the journal, and maybe I think we could probably share it into the chat, right? We are also looking forward to the new contribution of everyone. Thank you very much and good luck with the webinar.
Great, thank you very much, Ona. So today's webinar follows from the special issue, which explored questions and ideas at the intersection of heritage conservation, deconstruction, and material reuse, and was itself a follow-up to a 2018 symposium at Carleton University. While many fields, policies, and practices have been evolving in response to a recognition for the need to be better stewards of the world's resources, heritage conservation has actually been slow to do so. This, in spite of considerable volume of discarded materials generated not just through demolition, but through conservation processes and projects themselves. Yet, we also know there is a tremendous interest among those working in conservation, deconstruction, and material reuse who see the potential for each domain to positively influence and transform the other at both conceptual and practical levels. This interest was reflected in the response to the special issues call for abstracts, with proposals coming from across the world from a range of disciplines, addressing a broad range of contexts from demolition to the management of post-disaster debris. And it's also reflected in the interest in today's webinar, which drew close to 500 registrants from many countries. In making connections between previously disparate domains and practices, the shared goal is to encourage a reassessment of key concepts and frameworks associated with heritage, waste, value, conservation, and material reuse in order to better align them with 21st century cultural priorities and the circular economy. Today's panel presentations highlight what we believe to be some key issues. Our first presentation is by Satu Huka, and it's about the relationship between building conservation and the circular economy. It sets the stage for the webinar through a comparative analysis of the conceptual underpinnings of conservation and CE, examining how each could influence and be harnessed by the other for more effective results. Susan Ross will then critically examine values-based conservation through the lens of deconstruction and material reuse, raising questions about how values are defined and assessed and the implications of identifying value-bearing and non-value-bearing materials. The final presentation by Tina McCarthy uses a case study, the not-for-profit emergent structures, to examine possible futures for end-of-life cycle structures, considering not only the persistence of heritage value through material reuse, but the potential for a more holistic conceptualization of conservation treatment types. Following these presentations, we'll have a 12-minute Q&A among panelists, during which they will pose questions to each other. This will be followed by an 18-minute Q&A session, during which the panelists will respond to questions from participants. The webinar will then conclude with a brief wrap-up. And please note, as is shown on screen, that you will remain muted throughout the webinar, but can use the chat button at the bottom of the screen to raise technical and logistical issues, whereas content questions for the panelists should be posed via the Q&A button on the bottom, and participants can like questions posed by others to help prioritize them for response. During the open Q&A session, my role will be to collect the questions that you've provided and to present them to panelists. And with that we will now hear from our three panelists, starting with Satu Huka, who will speak to us about building conservation and the circular economy.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm honored to get to kick off the webinar by discussing building conservation in the context of circular economy. My presentation is based on an article by myself and my colleague, Associate Professor Emerita Inge Westergaard from Aarhus School of Architecture in Denmark. I also draw material from another article by my colleague Ida Kalakoski and myself. So the purpose of our paper and the presentation today is to discuss the relation between conservation and circularity. And here is how I plan to go about it. I'll start with a brief introduction. I'll then discuss circular economy theory and conservation theory separately. Before concluding, I will draw some parallels between the two, but also highlight certain differences. The main thesis that follows is that conservation and circular economy are often erroneously seen as inherently contradictory to one another, when the fact is that, on the contrary, they have a lot in common and are fundamentally more compatible than perhaps many people realize. In our modernized societies, we tend to have a negative perception about old materials or reusing pre-used items. We associate that kind of activity with poverty and marginality. Due to the way we demolish buildings, demolition is also kind of a violent activity. It communicates decline and decay. It doesn't send good vibes. Conservation is an activity that's situated within our greater culture. If we generally feel negative about waste and reuse, it's no wonder conservation has also taken a fairly negative stance towards circularity. I admit that because circular economy is often promoted by slogans such as waste as a resource, it may at first glance seem like to circulate is contradictory to conserving. So when you familiarize yourself with the one branch of the heritage discipline that specifically studies the reuse of ancient marbles or spolia, you'll find out that some conservationists seem to disdain their subject of study. To exaggerate a bit, when they see the creative spolia in the 11th century house Casa dei Crescenzi in Rome, they go like, oh my God, the building where those marbles originally came from must have really been something. And for the love of God, the kind of violence it must have endured. So even if we vaguely realize that reuse, prior to our era, which is an age of abundance, was sparked by absolute necessity, that moralization still easily escapes our lips. And I think that's telling of the difficult relation between conservation and circularity, which I would argue is largely based on a misunderstanding. So let's first have a look at the guiding principles of circular economy. Circular economy is about recognizing that we live on a planet that has boundaries. It's limited, not infinite. It has certain resources that are finite and others that can regenerate. In circular economy, we try to reinvent our industrial production so that it mimics the fundamental circular mechanisms that this planet operates through. For renewable resources, we can introduce loops based on natural biological cycles. For non-renewable resources, we must introduce technical loops that ensure that we don't waste them, we don't run out of them, and we get the best value out of the resources that have already been extracted. There's also the idea of cascading, meaning a gradual downgrading over time as the item or material wears out. It may no longer be feasible for the most demanding purpose, but you can repurpose it for a less demanding function and still maintain its utility for years to come, and so avoid the extraction of virgin resources. Now, if you put these two figures together and create an application specifically for buildings, like Inge and I did in our paper, the result might look something like this. This would be your circular economy hierarchy for buildings, where you prioritize conservation with minimal effort, such as maintenance or material conserving repairs or refurbishment. You would proceed to the outer circles or lower levels only if the better option would really not be feasible. So if anyone told you that circular economy is about recycling, that's just not true at all. Recycling is actually one of the last resorts we should go for. In industrial ecology, which is the field that studies circular economy, we use material flow analysis, or MFA, and life cycle assessment, or LCA, to evidence this. So in architectural conservation, then again, we are very skeptical towards heritage objects being relocated or repurposed. And evidence of this is the fact that conservation doctrines, such as ICOMOS documents, reject the idea of recontextualization quite strictly. On the other hand, conservation is supposedly moving towards more permissive ideas regarding adaptation and utility of heritage. At the same time, the amount of potential heritage is increasing exponentially as the result of post-war modernist industrialized construction boom. This emerging heritage is very different from the traditional artisanal heritage, not only in terms of volume, but also in terms of materials. And the tools and methods of conservation are often not well suitable to address its issues. So the heritage discipline is still only trying to grasp how to deal with it. Our argument in the paper is that tapping into circular economy could be one solution for this dilemma. In conservation theory, you find this twofold stance towards circular activities. It's considered an innate feature of vernacular built heritage. You can find arguments that building parts or materials in wooden buildings would have been designed for recurrent renewal, so basically circular economy. But then on the other hand, it's definitely not acceptable to do the same in building conservation. Here the doors are reused, if you're wondering. It would be okay to manufacture similar new doors, but not to reuse doors that once belonged to another building, even if it meant that the old doors would be scrapped. And mine and Inge's question is, why? Why is that? Because conservation, the way it's traditionally understood, it's allegedly all about preserving the fabric, preserving the material. The material allegedly carries the memories, values, and meanings that can be attributed to heritage. So how come it's better to demolish than to relocate? How come it's better to scrap than to reuse and reinterpret? How is that in any way in line with the stated stewardship for the material evidence? And why does the principle only apply to a fraction of potential heritage? Why are material conserving battery repairs easily accepted in the conservation of vernacular built heritage, but not at all as easily in the preservation of industrially built buildings? Why does conservation give up on its principles so easily when it faces modernist heritage? To synthesize, we found that the fundamentals of circular economy and fabric-focused conservation are the same, largely based on minimal intervention to material. However, a major difference is that conservation loses its interest in the heritage much earlier. Turns out, many conservationists also find the obsession for material altogether outdated and uninteresting. And that's understandable, because as I said in the beginning, conservation doesn't happen in a void. It's an image of the society at large. So in a society that's oblivious to the planetary boundaries, I guess conservation is bound to lose its interest in the preservation of material. I don't blame that. Even under sustainable development, we've been led to believe that culture, ecology, and economy could somehow be different entities. When the truth is that economy, just like conservation, is a manifestation of our culture, our linear culture. But our culture needs a healthy planet to survive. So we better adapt our culture because we have no other place to go. If we realize this, we could render the conflict between fabric-focused and utility or meanings-focused conservation obsolete, because their aims would start aligning. When all things material are valuable and almost nothing is waste, as is the case in circular economy, we need not spend time debating what should be conserved and how. We could instead focus on the meanings people give to the material. And honestly, circular economy needs the input from conservation. In our linear society, conservationists are some of the few people who know how to preserve with minimal intervention. When we transition to circular economy, and I don't think we have a choice here, the expertise from practical conservation is needed more than ever, badly. I have a brief epilogue before I wrap up. So I wonder if any of you paid attention to the cover photo that I used. This building was a railway station. It was built in 1990 and demolished in 2017. So it was younger than me, and I count as a millennial. The building was there for 27 years, which is only 1/3 of a person's life expectancy. Its demolition had nothing to do with its technical condition. This is just one example of many similar cases. Regardless of what you may think of the architectural quality or heritage value of this building or other similar modern buildings, this simply isn't good enough. We have to do better. And if conservation isn't in on this, then conservation is a manifestation of an outdated cowboy ideology of unlimited frontiers. And I don't think that's what conservation is fundamentally about. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. I now hand over to Susan Ross for her presentation.
Hello, and thanks to Victoria for the introduction and to Satu for your excellent start. I also want to thank both Satu and Tina and all the co-authors of the special issue of the journal. My understanding of heritage and waste is constantly expanded by exposure to such brilliant young scholars who are looking for ways to make heritage work do more for the planet and society. If heritage processes of evaluation, designation, and conservation are key to deciding what is worth keeping and how we care for it, how do these processes impact on what we decide not to keep? In this presentation, I will be discussing how heritage conservation relates to sustainable waste management, and I will do this by examining how heritage and waste both relate to value, looking at how waste is defined, how this could impact how we think our materials, legacies, how we think of our materials legacies, and how this could inform the values discourse in heritage, and so challenge what we've been coming to call values-based conservation. Ultimately, studying heritage waste relationships will force us to make space for new values to support new approaches to reuse. So before entering into a more conceptual discussion about possible change, a few points and examples about the current context. A concern for waste arises instinctively out of the sense that lost heritage leads to material losses, to expanding landfill, and to ongoing damage to the planet, as we continually extract or harvest new resources for new building materials. The urgency of defining new approaches, be it in policy or practices, is brought about by the scale and acceleration of deliberate demolition and less controlled disaster, but also by how the scarcity of resources of all kinds will only continue to amplify social inequities and injustices. The relationship of waste management to sustainable development goals for reducing consumption and related impacts on the natural environment express clear values that seem closely connected to conservation objectives across the natural, cultural, heritage spectrum. However, if we consider how small a fragment of the built environment is designated or official heritage, we cannot take for granted that the values identified and interpreted in heritage places and processes we follow to protect or enhance related material elements are working enough towards these goals. Even within a heritage property, often only some elements are considered important to preserve. Conservation work often includes decisions that lead to parts of buildings being demolished, sometimes entire phases of later construction. It's also heavily involved in the ongoing production and consumption of new materials as part of replacement and alterations. There are nonetheless many examples of materials reused to different degrees on or from heritage sites. A more exceptional case, perhaps, is the Jefferson Hall housing project in Ottawa that made prominent use of valued limestone from the deconstruction of the church's assembly hall on the same site. This direct salvage example is now even seen as part of the heritage values, suggesting the importance attached to site values for materials. However, in most cases of reuse of salvaged heritage materials, we may see very limited reuse and on a completely different site with almost no direct relationship, such as the case with the reuse of ornamental terracotta nurses salvaged from a historic downtown Vancouver medical high-rise, the only thing salvaged at the time of its demolition, as part of a new green building at the campus of University of British Columbia. Interestingly, the site interpretation makes some connection between the past health and the current technical innovation uses, but it also highlights the citizens' unsuccessful campaign to have prevented the demolition. Still, in other cases, limited reuse on a site is part of variations on facadism, such as these two examples in Vancouver and Montreal, where parts of existing walls are reused in defining the limits of new site uses, such as gardens and parking lots. While the sense that heritage has been saved here will probably seem very limited, it's also unclear how well any sustainability goals were achieved. So while this series of examples illustrate somewhat anecdotally some of the context for materials reuse that may exist, they also suggest the need to understand the gaps that prevent more integrated approaches. So shifting now to some of the analytical work that could lead to new approaches, such skeletal reuse approaches that we often see in facadism, gutting, or skinning buildings have their counterparts, in my mind, in the selective protection of just a few heritage buildings in an entire urban block undergoing redevelopment. So a starting point in thinking how we define heritage in relation to waste is to consider the destiny of the wider building stock. When we assign heritage values to single buildings, streetscapes, or districts, are we not implicitly taking value away from the rest? The concept of waste has been defined as the absence of value. So values-based conservation processes that assign heritage values and identify only limited associated elements to be protected can arguably contribute to creating waste. Both heritage and waste are connected with values and hierarchies. What heritage processes do not value remain to be reclaimed, reused, or transformed, or if not, then discarded and sent to landfill. More sustainable waste management hierarchies based on assessment such as life cycle analysis and such as we've been hearing from Satu recognize building conservation as more efficient than materials recycling, but they go further, as we also heard. So efforts to avoid life cycle impacts redefine discards not as waste by addressing less desirable characteristics to ensure safety and permit the redevelopment or the development of new economies. It's in this context that ideas, perhaps quite radical, like urban mining, are emerging. So where should we draw the line between quarrying the city and our selective conservation approaches? Many characteristics that confer materials with heritage values, such as integrity, but also local provenance and suitability to climate, also matter in processes of reclamation and reuse. Other associated values of materials are more challenging to address, including both toxicity or the presence of hazards to life, and more qualitative aspects like perceived disposability or poor capacity to age. Now, given the importance of connecting waste to value, the expanding scholarship on heritage values over the last century provides an important context for relating heritage and waste. Comprehensive efforts to understand how to define heritage value and related concepts, such as authenticity and integrity, have helped identify useful values typologies, but also, at the same time, some of the issues with classification. While layering and diversity of values is increasingly accepted and appreciated, both dissonant associated values and an accumulation of harmful physical characteristics may be more difficult to reconcile. So recognizing this complexity and the mutability of values over time can perhaps help make space for needed new perspectives while challenging the focus on highly valued character-defining elements. One of the promising areas that has developed momentum is the bridging between heritage values and those of environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Looking specifically at materials, their origins and impacts draw attention to multiple other values, such as ecological values regarding habitat, biodiversity, or ecosystems, but also the embodied environmental effects of material histories that were amplified through repeated transformation and transportation. Importantly, there's an opportunity then to address these past impacts. As material production became increasingly less local or dependent on unseen resources and people, this not only impacted our sense of craft and expression, but responsibility to unknown externalities. Exploring the histories of building materials can also show that people have always rebuilt reusing past materials, as Satu also has alluded to, with cycles of rebuilding buried in most historic urban landscapes. When there were less materials or other resources, we have always turned to disassembly to keep valued materials in use. However, contexts of more deliberate destruction are also important, and these are also not new. What is perhaps newer is the scale and speed at which we expect to clean up, which has, for one, eliminated skilled wrecking intended for salvage. Salvage has come to be seen as a last resort instead of a common action. An architectural salvage yard is seen as an unfortunate place. The economies of these liminal places, including multiple more informal sites of salvage, where a limited quantity of more valued elements find temporary refuge, could be reinforced by expanded requirements for reuse that include policies that help identify how values are both preserved and transformed. Approaches to materials in both heritage and waste could also be better informed by a recent rise in the study of materiality, which looks at materials as more active agents, part of social and material networks and landscapes. The study of these entanglements and the trajectories of material flows will be important to consider in creating a context for more informed and productive approaches to managing material futures. As Jane Hutton's work on reciprocal landscapes has shown, there are also generally contexts that pay more attention to embedded disparate social and economic outcomes. Recognizing all materials as potential heritage can help to resist less productive values classifications. As Alison Arlotta has argued, in practice, formerly valued artifacts and waste coexist, and that a new understanding of both could be derived by considering them collectively rather than separately. Ultimately, both heritage, conservation practitioners, and waste managers work with valued materials, and as such, much could be gained by greater engagement with building components and fragments and the flow of materials from building to building and place to place. Better understanding of materials as materials, while recovering the stories that link them to other places across time and to other associated values to consider in conservation, help open the door for processes more focused on conserving their embodied effects and ensuring their reclamation through deconstruction and reuse. These processes can not only sustain but generate new values. Processes critical of past impacts, as I was mentioning before, that conserve materials to avoid further impacts will likely generate new values. However, the new values may also be associated with new uses and desired values emerging in the places materials are moved to. As Alison Kriba has written about, critically, the potential for values transformation processes begins at the demolition site and continues in multiple places over time. Given also the need for new social and economic values, the transfer of value from buildings to components, which Satu also alluded about as one of our major gaps, can also be seen as an opportunity to address or reconcile multiple new goals. To summarize some of these ideas, I will suggest new approaches for reuse which introduce a range of goals and activities for heritage work. Fundamentally, we need to recognize that there are important values beyond designated buildings and character-defining elements. Speaking to my, another element is that we have to be reconsidering removal of later and modern additions in repairable condition. As part of coming to terms with so-called disposable materials, we tend to remove and replace. Our expertise in developing repairs needs to expand. We need to challenge ourselves as the ones who'll figure out how to repair what's considered unrepairable. Those materials that are reclaimed should be kept on site or sorted and usefully labeled for reuse and storage. Processes of heritage management should involve tracking where salvage materials go, how they are used, and documenting challenges. This suggests also the need to expand the roles of heritage inventories to indicate more information on materials, quantities, and characteristics useful to understand for reuse. Finally, and not the least, conservation planning should look for opportunities to specify reclaimed materials in new additions, insertions, and infill, encouraging this as part of policy documents. Notably, in the context, very current context of many governments announcing budgets for carbon retrofits as part of COVID-19 recovery, let's make sure that retrofit includes materials as well as buildings reuse. To better understand the potential for all this, I've been tracking stories that reveal embedded histories while embodying new reuse objectives. At UBC, for example, in Vancouver, the CK Choi building exceptionally incorporated the former University Armory's timber structure as structure, while designing to protect the campus forests. However, analysis of the demolition and reuse has revealed untold and perhaps unresolved stories of dissonant values. The pressure to reuse existing building stock as material banks is growing in Europe, following more stringent requirements for waste reduction in the building industry. In this context, new forms of assembly are being experimented with that help scale up the management of materials being reclaimed from both older and more modern buildings, offering many more cases on salvage and reuse opportunities to study. Alongside these projects to be studied are possible models. New types of inventories are being developed that help market reclaimed material while tracking their histories. As the vast materials legacy of the 20th century becomes the focus of stewardship, understanding of how to transfer values in components and not just whole buildings becomes crucial. Current processes that assume the benefits of recycling modern materials should be questioned by the knowledge of embedded effects in the assemblies of materials themselves, looking instead to preserve more consolidated evidence of past use while limiting destructive dismantling. Deconstruction for reuse on a larger scale will unsettle assumptions about craft, labor, and industry. Such projects were given high profile in this recent article in The Guardian, which was reshared extensively on social media. My presentation has focused on needed change in heritage concepts around material values. However, I also recognize there's much to be done in making waste management more sustainable and more aware of social, cultural, and historic significance of what are often calculated technical, economic, environmental strategies. Ultimately, heritage advocates and practitioners are the ones who have the most interest in keeping heritage out of the scrapyard, and so we'll need to work to define best practices for deconstruction and reuse. Finding the balance between building reuse and materials reuse may be a challenge, but we need to be part of the discussion. And hopefully I have helped to articulate some of the arguments. Here are some sources I would recommend for further understanding, including an article I wrote that addresses the CK Choi case study in a special issue. I also note that I have, and two articles in the special issue that talk a lot about the question of values. I also note that I have a website on waste heritage research where many additional resources are identified. So next up is Tina to help us understand the possibilities of deconstruction. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan. Give me just a moment here to get my screen up. Okay. So in Deconstructing Heritage, co-written with Eleni, we explore the potential of building deconstruction as a strategy for historic preservation practice, replacing demolition as a final treatment for building removal when all other preservation strategies fail. As you can see, the process of demolition and deconstruction are both techniques of building removal, but they have very different outcomes. Deconstruction is the process of disassembling a building methodically, reversing the construction process to maintain the integrity of individual components upon removal. This strategy is aimed at preserving as much building material as possible for reuse, recycling the rest to achieve landfill waste diversion rates of up to 90%. Adopting the practice of building deconstruction connects historic preservation to the social, economic, and environmental benefits of sustainability, reinforcing the discipline's existing commitment to preserve embodied energy through building reuse. Replacing demolition with building deconstruction creates an opportunity to redefine the concept of death in the built environment, harnessing its energy to serve heritage goals of memory, revival, and sustainable community development. In our paper, we explore the case of the Andersons twins. 414 and 418 Anderson Street, Savannah, Georgia. By 2017, these structures had suffered a decade of abandonment and blight. 414 collapsed from damage sustained in Hurricane Irma, while 418 listed dangerously to one side, threatening to collapse itself. A judge found the structure and ordered their demolition, superseding the city's review process for raising historic properties. Scott Kreutzer, who was then executive director of the nonprofit Emergent Structures and Repurposed Savannah, noticed the plight of the buildings and reached out to the Historic Savannah Foundation, which held a preservation easement on the properties. Scott pitched the idea of deconstructing rather than demolishing the Anderson twins. Working with the property owner and the foundation, an agreement was reached. Repurpose would be allowed to deconstruct 418 and salvage its materials if they also removed the debris pile from 414. Work started with documentation. The students at Savannah Technical College drew measured floor plans, elevations, and 3D models, documenting 418 and creating a digital reconstruction of 414. The history of the homes was also researched and recorded. In the end, 65 tons of historic materials were salvaged from these condemned and collapsed buildings. 60% of all building removal waste was diverted from landfill. The Savannah Grays, also known as McAlpine's gray brick, are bricks made from the gray clay of Henry McAlpine's Hermitage Plantation located on the Savannah River. The bricks, handmade by slaves in the early 19th century, are an important part of Savannah's heritage, contributing a distinct beauty to its architecture while also speaking of difficult aspects of its history. These bricks almost didn't survive the deconstruction process. Because the repurposed team was engaging in their first deconstruction, they had contracted a deconstruction supervisor to help train workers and manage the site. Focusing on energy and cost effectiveness, the contractor tested the value of the bricks in the chimneys by dropping them from the roof. Since they shattered on impact, he concluded they were poor quality and not worth saving. The repurposed team immediately intervened, explaining the heritage value of the brick and constructing a chute out of old doors to convey the bricks safely to the ground. The organization ended up making a profit on the project due to the resale value of the bricks. Some of these bricks were purchased by the Coastal Heritage Society for use in landscaping at their museum, while others were used in private residences. Another heritage material that was salvaged from the Anderson twins was longleaf pine. Longleaf pine is an endangered species today due to its dependence on fire to reproduce. The lumber's cell structure and resin content make it perform like a hardwood, rot resistant and extremely strong. The deconstruction of the Anderson twins drew strong community support, involving over 832 volunteer hours. The project is showcased on the organization's website, which presents historic and architectural information about the homes, alongside stories and examples of reclaimed materials and reuse projects. The webpage offers an invitation to the community to share stories about the deconstructed homes or to post projects completed with their reclaimed materials. The organization's success in working with historic properties can be traced to their hierarchy of reuse, a policy that determines which jobs they decide to take. Topping this hierarchy is the imperative statement, save the building. Repurposed Savannah only accepts projects that have been already slated for demolition. From this point, they link materials reuse values with community and materials integrity, keeping salvage materials local and as intact as possible. For the organization, this is an expression not only of respect for heritage, but of social justice and economic equity. Disintegrated materials provide an opportunity to tell new stories. Materials heritage is the history of work, of workers, the builders and makers rather than the designers and owners. These contributors are often unrecognized in a heritage practice focused on architectural product rather than process. Connecting these stories through a practice that simultaneously promotes contemporary workforce development and ecological stewardship provides a compelling vision of heritage actively employing the past in the present to create a more equitable future. In the practice of deconstruction and materials reuse, however, such outcomes are not guaranteed. In my research, I came across the work of Kaylee Herstad, who studied the reuse marketplace in Detroit, a city that has experimented with the deconstruction as a part of its blight removal program. Herstad observed that the potential of material reuse to restore community identity and history is largely unrealized. Instead, the city's painful history of racial and economic injustice is reinforced. As low-income, blighted Black neighborhoods are dismantled, their materials are repurposed as expensive craft goods, marketed with a sanitized narrative of reclamation to a mostly white upper-class clientele. Except for the jobs generated by deconstruction itself, Herstad found the source communities are excluded from the economic and cultural benefits of materials reuse. As this research indicates, more work is needed to understand the complex meanings in material reuse and overcoming underlying social inequities. Just as Repurposed Savannah developed careful policies to retain heritage value through deconstruction, materials reuse also requires attentive facilitation to ensure that the reuse benefits the community of origin. Would the community-based repurpose approach encourage diverse participation in the Detroit reuse market? If deconstruction and reuse is to facilitate social and economic equity, questions like this must be explored. As the story of the Savannah Gray bricks emphasizes, material evaluation within deconstruction is a critical issue, determining what is saved. Heritage values are not adequately addressed by current deconstruction industry practices. By clearly defining the terms of engagement for deconstruction and recognizing the heritage value of materials, Repurposed Savannah is able to work more effectively with historic properties and the organizations dedicated to preserving them in place. Maintaining the historic connections of building materials is not inherent in the processes of either deconstruction or reuse. The idea of heritage materials requires awareness and interpretive support throughout both processes. Repurpose has developed specific policies to support historic stewardship in the materials they remove, demonstrating a potential framework for preservation professionals to engage with materials heritage through deconstruction. The near loss of the Savannah Gray bricks also reminds us that preservationists have missed countless opportunities to preserve the salvageable parts of buildings and to further integrate sustainable design into preservation practice by focusing the scope of their work exclusively on maintaining whole buildings in place. In the United States, as well as abroad, the current regulatory system does not value deconstruction as a treatment for historic buildings. Yet the critical heritage literature reviewed by the authors in Waste and Heritage Special Issue suggests that expanding heritage values to include elements of change and transition is not only possible, it has the potential to enhance heritage practice. So therefore, I conclude with the following recommendations. In the United States, to update the Secretary of the Interior standards to include deconstruction. To work collaboratively with sustainability and other community advocates to establish deconstruction as the default building removal technique for older buildings. And also to support phenomenological research studies to substantiate the heritage value in salvage and materials reuse. So now we will have a Q&A session between the panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you, Susan and Satu, for those very thought-provoking presentations that have certainly got people chatting away in the chat box and asking some great questions. As mentioned at the beginning, what we're going to start by doing is actually having a Q&A session between the panelists, during which each one will have the opportunity to ask and to respond to a question. And I'm going to turn to Tina to ask the first question.
Thank you. My question is for Satu. Satu, I'm wondering what kinds of information are currently tracked by circular economy practitioners about materials through their various life cycles, and how could this information be used or supplemented by adding heritage values to the discourse of the discipline?
So, to be honest with you, I don't think there is such a profession as CE practitioners, circular economy practitioners, at least not in large scale, not yet. I think it's still more about research than actual practicing, apart for the traditional recycling waste treatment bit. In the research, there are many approaches in many scales. There are material flow analysis of cities or regions or states. You can have on the building level transformability analysis. You also have indicators for deconstructibility of structures or connections or the recyclability of materials. And there have been ideas presented for having material passports, mainly for new buildings where you could embed these kind of indicators for the transformability, deconstructibility or recyclability. But I wouldn't say the current practices for circular economy cover the whole life cycle of buildings, and it's all more arbitrary than consistent. And I think overall circular economy is still emerging, and that's another reason why I think this would be the right time for conservationists and circular economy people to join forces and to push for the change and consider these frameworks. So how you could actually then transfer the information also concerning the provenience of the materials or structures forward if they are indeed deconstructed. I would then pose a question for Susan to continue from here. So when you discuss with heritage professionals, at least here in Finland, many or if not most of them actually express some kind of acceptance towards partial preservation in the form of material or component reclamation. And they also encourage it if whole building conservation is out of the question. However, they also acknowledge that as heritage professionals, they have to choose their battles. And they currently have no tools at their disposal that they could use to argue for reclamation. So why do you think that is? Why do the borders of heritage management systems lie where they currently do? And can the heritage discipline address and negotiate those borders with the greater society from within the discipline?
Thank you, Satu, for these questions. Lots of things to think about in them. I guess for the first one, you probably have to look at, so your question, why the borders of heritage management systems lie where they currently do. I think you probably have to look at that in different contexts, whether you're talking, like you've already alluded to, academia versus practice, but also different countries and different cultural traditions. Because I think that arguably, at least at a theoretical level and perhaps like a kind of heritage discourse level, we've been seeing quite a shift from a paradigm, from paradigms that could help us to actually break down this barrier. So this is both in terms of shifts we've been talking about from fabric to associated values. As people start to embrace what heritage means, and they become more open to conservation achieving different things. But I think also shifts from seeing conservation as a form of sort of resistance and just keeping things as they are to being aware that you're managing change and you're engaging with many others as part of that process. Now, of course, the extent to which the shift in paradigm I'm talking about, which many of us might have heard about, is endorsed by different scholars, practitioners, authorities, or community advocates, is going to vary quite a bit. I personally see a trend towards realizing that heritage has more to do with, it has to do a lot more than just protecting buildings and materials. And that part of this comes from an expansion of our objectives. You know, we've all talked about links with sustainability. I think that connecting outwards to other goals that are part of society is an important part of that. And, you know, I have to say personally, as a Canadian, this also includes in settler colonial states like Canada, that we have to understand, you know, that we play a global role in mining and forestry and in materials, you know, sustainable materials and related waste management, but also, you know, that we have to start thinking about how to reconcile what we've always considered to be our achievements embodied in our built heritage with, you know, some of the materials legacies that are more negative. So I think there's, I mean, I'm speaking, I guess, to, there is a paradigm shift. It's not necessarily fully there, but we need to continue to work on it. And I think that's my answer. So am I the one that asks the next question? Okay. Oh, wait a minute. No, I didn't answer your second question, did I? Sorry, I just realized because it was a two-parter there. Your second part was about, can the heritage discipline address and negotiate those borders with greater society from within the discipline? I guess that I would say no. And that's partly because I would take a position that we should not be trying to control what we're doing as a kind of authoritative role, if I understand your question correctly. And I also tend to see heritage more as a field than a discipline. So an area of action with many actors, as opposed to something that we need to define what we do in our group. It's more about how we engage with others in multiple activities. And what I think is interesting there in part is that with what I was talking about is we're starting to recognize that materials themselves are actors, that materials and their enduring legacy are actually something we have to engage with on their own level. And I think that we already have in conservation many materials experts, many people who have helped us to understand, you know, specific stones and issues. I think that, or you know, species of timber, histories of certain, you know, resources where they came from. I think that we could look to develop more understanding and use that understanding to help inform other conversations that are happening about sustainable materials and waste. So now I think I've answered the two questions. And I think that I'm now going to turn to Tina with a question. Okay, I was sort of looking at Victoria, just making sure I was in the, okay. So Tina, this kind of in some ways builds upon the fact that my last answer was kind of going against the grain in that I'm talking about we need to know more about materials. So in the interest in making heritage more sustainable makes it very difficult to forget about materials. Okay, however, in some ways, for me, this is one of the directions that critical heritage ideas have been going in recent years. So you could see this as being related on the one hand to increasing appreciation for intangible heritage, and also more of a focus on social values and heritage. So I think your work is helping to show how social ideals can be connected to a persistent interest in materiality as part of sustainability, but also as part of cultural heritage. So I'm just wondering, given that there is this other group of trend going towards distancing ourselves more from worrying about the materials or fabric, how should we engage with them nevertheless? Even, you know, if they're trying to say, well, we've talked too much about materials. What do you think?
Yeah, we have a lot of materials. That's not my whole answer, but I think I have felt somewhat engaged by those ideas myself in the past because of the flexibility that they allow in the interpretation and particularly the participatory engagement with heritage in the present tense. That's something that has always been really important to me, making that connection. So I think in that way, I really responded to those ideas. But when I was researching my paper, I came across the work of Sian Jones. And that work really emphasized that the network of relationships is between people, places, and things. That is what is important about materials. It's really not the materials themselves. The materials are a vessel. So direct experience of an object leads to personal attachment and to a relationship network that really lets people engage with heritage in a way that is difficult to do in a lot of cases without that material conduit. And I think that salvage materials have this amazing ability to enter that space, to be at once heritage and also unbounded, unregulated, the way that buildings and site heritage has been handled by heritage practitioners, I think could be very different with salvage materials. And they really open space for people to engage with history, bring it into their own lives, reinterpret it. And I think that's, I find that really powerful. And I think that people who are leaning towards a more dynamic interpretation of heritage might also as well. So that's my answer.
And I think that actually opens the door to mentioning an idea that one of the other authors in the special issue, or a couple of the other authors refer to, around the notion that when we're engaging with these salvage materials, there's the possible for past presencing. So a sort of, like you say, a more different connected moment to the past that we can work with and take forward. And so I really love Satu's ouch slide where she's talking, when people see reused materials in another place, how can we get people to feel that that's actually exciting? So where are we at?
I think we're perhaps ready to do an open Q&A session. So now's the opportunity to turn to the questions and answers that you've been placing in the Q&A box, and thanks as well to people for liking questions, because that actually will help us prioritize the questions that are responded to today. And something that I'd mention is that in a follow-up, we will be trying to perhaps respond to some of the questions after this event via email. So I'm just going to start the Q&A session. There are quite a few questions about materials themselves, salvage materials. And so the first question we have is, we are often discouraged from salvaging materials because of hazardous materials contamination. Do you have any suggestions for countering these arguments? I'm actually going to start by directing that question to Susan Ross, but feel free for others to jump in. I just know that Susan has quite often talked about toxic materials, and she works a lot with modern materials. So, Susan?
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. And thanks for the question. It is a really important one. I know when I first started looking into deconstruction and criteria for salvage, that it was almost as if on, at the one end of the spectrum in heritage, we have our valued elements, our character defining elements. In deconstruction and reuse, you have the toxic materials that are so hard to deal with, so they're at opposite ends of the spectrum of understanding, and in between there are a lot of other opportunities of overlap. So just in terms of basic values we associate, there's very few people associating positive values with anything that is hazardous to life. So, however, that said, something that I would put forward as an initial argument is it's like with many other things, we need to better understand what we're looking at. I was part of a discussion recently where someone was really clarifying the difference between risk and hazard. Hazard is a really known problem. And so we really have to make sure that we're not just passing judgment on materials based on assumed risks. And so that we do the type of analysis that would let us assess what's required. And I'll give an example from a very personal experience. And I think this will speak to the fact that, at the contractors have different experience, different backgrounds. For one contractor, when they would see a material that has a surface level of treatment, wood in this case that was treated with tar in the past, they assessed that the wood had to be completely removed. They couldn't work with that as part of the next stages of the project. Another contractor came onto the site in a different stage in the project, and with a similar site, decided to take one panel down and look at it and discover to what extent it was just a surface issue, and came up with an approach that would cover it over so that you could keep the structural value of the wood. And it was, older wood, so it was really useful to take that approach. That was in the context of a conservation project, not a deconstruction, but that's one example. And the other thing is just the history. I mean, we're fortunately in a time of, there's an enormous amount of environmental histories being written now. So the history of polluting materials, the history of toxins. I think about when I took courses, workshops on health and safety to do with asbestos and renovation. There was very little understanding on the part of the people who were telling us what to do about historical research on asbestos, so that we could use that historical research on how asbestos has been used to better inform ourselves about what we're likely to find in a building. That you're going in with much more informed analysis. Okay, the building was built in this period, the changes were made in that period, the asbestos was introduced in this way, and these are therefore the strategies, instead of kind of assuming we got to go in and just take it all out. And of course, asbestos is managed very carefully with different levels, but I think that sort of gap between some of the science and knowledge that's coming out of people studying these things with the people on the ground, and then also different attitudes and working with people to inform them about what they could learn by engaging. So that's an initial response.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. Tina, Satu, anything to add to that?
I would just say from my experience, I have done a lot of window restoration and dealt with lead a lot. And I think a lot of people throw things away when they're contaminated with lead. They just figure it's not worth it. And I would just say, be willing to put in the time to deal with the mitigation. I can personally remove all of the lead from a window myself with very simple tools, contain the waste and dispose of it properly. So I think it's worth doing.
Thank you.
I could add to that I think from my perspective here in Finland, we have acquired that historical knowledge about the hazardous substances for the purpose of not even so much conservation, but simply for refurbishment and modernization of buildings. So I feel like it's not a matter that would be extensively discussed or considered like a main barrier for reusing, because we sort of know where we can expect to find those substances, and we know how to deal with them, how to remove them from buildings when you refurbish, and you can use the same procedures when you reuse. So I don't find that an issue that would come up so much.
Thank you to all three of you. Going to the next question. There's a question about modern materials. When traditional materials need to be repaired, we have crafts and tradespeople, although harder to find these days. Are there such folks for modern materials? Do modern materials require more processing before they can be reused, or is that my misconception? I'm going to start with directing that to Satu, but I know Susan and perhaps Tina will probably have things to say about that as well.
So I would say that the most of the activities in the repair or refurbishment sector deal with modern buildings. So there are procedures for this, both conserving and more radical approaches. But you do have, for example, for reinforced concrete structures, you do have established procedures for the condition investigation. And based on the results of the condition investigation, if you can have service life modeling, and if there's a reasonable service life left, you can apply lighter procedures such as patch repairs. Or if the damage is more widespread and more advanced, then you perhaps have to go for more radical alternatives like complete deconstruction, and there possibly is no service life left. But you can apply these same condition investigation and repair measures when you plan for reuse as if you plan for repair or refurbishment.
Thank you. Anything to add to that, Susan or Tina?
Sure, I'll make a couple of extra points. I mean, I agree. I think it's important when we're talking about the modern building stock for heritage to engage with wider refurbishment or renovation industries that are already in expansion. You know, as we see a lot of our post-war buildings going through renewal of different kinds. This is important to see in terms of the fact that because it's a bigger scale industry, sometimes it's actually already doing a lot more about things that seem mysterious in conservation. But that said, I do think it's also important for anybody who's asking a question like that one, who has no background perhaps in modern heritage, to realize that organizations like Docomomo or the Association for Preservation Technology and scientific committees within ICOMOS have been working for decades now to address issues in how to maintain and repair modern heritage. And there's a lot already to learn from that material. Perhaps what we could say, though, is that when you read now through the advice from a conservation perspective that's been developed, how much of that advice is actually supporting reuse? You know, and making sure that the principle of reuse of components and assemblies is something that's being considered, and not just trying to match the original in some way, or trying to improve the original in some way, but actually integrating that as one of the objectives.
Thank you. I'm going to actually turn to Tina now with a different question, because I think it picks up many of the questions that have been asked related to incentives or other measures. The question is, how do we encourage developers or property owners to choose deconstruction versus traditional demolition processes?
Well, as a preservation planner in Brookline, Mass, I oversee a demolition delay ordinance, and part of that process, and of course the heritage framework and varies greatly across the United States and even more so internationally, but this is just my experience. We have the ability under our demolition delay ordinance to negotiate a lift of this demolition delay in exchange for mitigation. And one of the things that I recently have just started asking developers is if they would be willing to salvage parts of the building, portions of it. I have not been successful in getting anyone to sign on to a full deconstruction, I will say that. I think there needs to be more infrastructure in place within the heritage community to say that this is a treatment, a preservation treatment, because otherwise, really, it's just me asking. We need guidance from the national level, at the national level, Secretary of Interior standards, for example, to draw on, because almost all preservation ordinances on the local level in the United States quote the Secretary of Interior standards. They say, this is the standard you must, if you're going to interact with this historic property, you have to do it in accordance with the Secretary's standards. So that would be really helpful to have that additional purview, because right now I don't technically have that purview, but because part of my job is negotiation, I just ask.
Thanks, Tina. And Satu, I wondered, do you have anything to add from a European perspective relating to encouraging developers or property owners?
Well, I think you could consider also sort of protection based on the carbon footprint or the environmental value of the materials. So that would be one idea to sort of expand the concept of preservation, not only to the heritage values, but also to the ecological material values. Then again, you could also have some kind of economic incentives. So if the property owner chose a better alternative, conservation of the building or deconstruction instead of demolition, they would get some kind of a economic benefit out of that. What it could be in more detail, I guess, would depend on the approach. So if it would be about conservation rather than deconstruction, then it could be like extra building allowance. So you could build some extra, as opposed to if you demolished the whole thing and built a completely new building. With deconstruction, you could maybe apply some kind of benefits for the building permits or the planning permits. That could be one option.
Susan, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I did actually want to add on to what both Tina and Satu have been talking about, and with the context of, I guess there's a couple of cities in North America, maybe a few more than a couple at this point, who have legislated or created bylaws or ordinances requiring deconstruction, especially in context where you're talking about older buildings. Whether it's, they give a date and they say you must deconstruct if you have a building beyond this date, or you must achieve a certain level of landfill avoidance. So clearly that's one of the ways. But I think that we also need to think about this from the economic perspective of why do we think it costs more and takes more time? And the fact is that in the demolition industry, there are starting to be more and more contractors interested in making deconstruction one of their services. Tina and I both participated in Building Materials Reuse Association presentations where you can see there's momentum that people, they call themselves, like they're former demolition people who are becoming deconstruction people. And they see the economic potential because they see the material values that, they get to take the materials out of the sites. And so I think that if you think about that, we're trying to persuade owners. I think owners also have this, their budget, their schedule and all of that in mind. So I think that starting to share some of that experience that's coming out of cities that are taking this on, municipalities that have created bylaws. One of the interesting places is San Antonio, where they've done both. They're looking both at trying to make sure that, they encourage deconstruction, but also training, providing opportunities for demolition contractors and also owners who want to see what it would be like to have deconstruction happen. And there's a lot of training out there available.
Thanks, Susan. Turning now to another pragmatic concern. There's a question from Nicolas Barrett. So beyond authenticity and character and clear benefits of reuse, I hope one of the panelists will be able to speak to some of the more mundane and pragmatic concerns that exist A, warranty and longevity, B, consistency and specifications. I sense there is a universal uneasiness to adopt materials without being able to validate physical integrity, given the liabilities that may arise post-construction. How does this get addressed in process and practice? And I'm going to start by asking Satu to comment on that.
I think this actually also connects with the previous question. So the economic incentive to deconstruct really requires that there is demand for the deconstructed material, so that the, because it's more expensive to deconstruct, so that then it pays off at the end. And I think it's a legitimate concern, and we just have to develop processes for deconstructed, salvaged building materials and building components in the same way as we have for new products or for recycled products. So there can be some laboratory testing involved, and with that we can develop processes where we can perform visual analysis, maybe analysis based on the sound, or an artificial intelligence-based examination of the products, so that there can be a recertification into construction products and the properties can be validated. So I think that is something that we just need to take on, and at the same time to look at the embodied carbon and embodied energy that's in the products, and what is the benefit as opposed to a completely new virgin product. Because we can see from life cycle analysis that the carbon footprint for the reused product can be very low. So if we can combine that information with the quality management and quality assurance procedure that's science-based and reliable, then I think we are moving towards the goal of increasing the reuse.
Thanks, Satu. Susan, Tina, would you like to add something?
Sorry, I'm just going to reread the question a little bit to make sure that I'm, yeah, I think I agree with Satu. I think that it's a question of taking the steps, going through the process. And I think there are examples. I know that in terms of the structural potential of timber reuse, I think APT has actually worked on trying to come up with a protocol so that we could reuse timber based on analysis of existing timber. And it was meant to reuse in conservation, but that can also be of value for reuse off-site. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why the CK Choi project that I mentioned at UBC was so interesting, was because there the engineers actually and we're able to do the work to reuse structure as structure. And it's incredibly important, because otherwise we end up with a lot of downcycling of timber, for example. There's a famous case in Ottawa. The Ottawa airport has wonderful wood elements which are downcycled from massive timbers that were part of buildings on the airport site. And this actually was taken to a national inquiry to discuss the problem that we have, that the timber industry cannot recognize the value of existing timber, the structural characteristics of existing timber. So, you know, the engineers and architects are interested in being able to do this. We just need to develop the labs and do the work and come up with protocols that are sometimes unusual. The benefit perhaps in deconstruction compared to conservation is we're often going to be able to take the elements into a lab.
Thank you, Susan. Tina, anything to add?
I think Susan and Satu made really good points about how this needs to be developed more technically. I would just add that reuse and repairability, kind of building things to be deconstructed and to be repairable, it's a very different kind of warranty procedure. And I think that our current structure with warranties and all these sort of requirements in the building code for certain levels of performance, I'm not sure exactly if all of it is beneficial or if it's tied to the industry that created it. I think some of it's beneficial, but I do question the structure of it a little bit.
Thank you.
Can I just add one more thing to that? Because something we didn't talk about is the provenance being interesting. Sorry.
We'll have to be quick just because we're going to have to wrap up in about 30 seconds here.
Okay.
But 30 seconds.
Oh, just wanted to say that, I mean, we're looking at this almost sort of just from the perspective, the negative perspective, but the flip side is that there's value in the materials, right? And so we're sort of assuming it has to be proven. Quite often there's demonstrated really important value that people want the materials. They want these elements, right? So tracking that, integrating that into it is also part of what we need to be able to do.
Great. Thanks, Susan. So we are actually almost out of time. And so at this point, we're actually going to turn to the webinar wrap up. And sorry. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank people for their excellent questions. So of course, these questions address some very pragmatic issues related to techniques, toxic materials, skills, incentives, and so on. What's clear from both this event and earlier discussions is that in order for the domains of conservation, deconstruction, and material reuse to influence one another in meaningful ways, considerable work is required. Experts in the field of deconstruction have pointed to the need for new economic and accounting models to enable and encourage material reuse. We've certainly heard about a host of other issues about which people have concerns. And in our guest editorial in the special issue, Susan and I identified areas of research analysis that we believe are critical to advancing the transition to a more sustainable conservation system and set of practices. And so what we identified, and much of which is being discussed today, included exploring the potential for more expansive and inclusive value typologies, principles, and policies to take into consideration the full lives of materials and not simply whole structures and places, exploring the potential to situate conservation treatment types within a broader continuum of actions that would include building relocation and deconstruction, exploring and acknowledging the tensions between conservation and deconstruction to develop arguments that promote both and avoid conflict, exploring training and education needs for those working in conservation and trades to foster awareness and build capacity with respect to deconstruction and material reuse, and finally exploring how surveys and inventories might be adapted and expanded to consider the entirety of our built inheritance, notably that of the second half of the 20th century, given its abundance, rather than limiting ourselves to the oldest and rarest places. And I'm sure that those of you participating in the webinar could identify many other research priorities to further this domain. In the short term, we're planning to prepare a brief follow-up via email to all of you, in which we might respond to some unanswered questions, identify resources such as books, articles, and websites, and discuss some possible next steps and upcoming initiatives. And we also hope that all of you will take advantage of the free access to the special issue which Emerald Publishing has so generously provided. And with that, we hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and we hope to remain in touch with those of you who are working in this really important area. I'd like to thank our three panelists and our co-organizers, Mario, Lori, and Ona, my colleague Zeynep, and NSERC Create Heritage Engineering at Carleton University, with the collaboration of Tampere University, ERA, Emerald Publishing, ICOMOS Canada, and the Association for Preservation Technology. And so wishing you all a good day and evening. Thank you very much.